I learned, slowly and reluctantly, that independence is a project that sometimes needs scaffolding. The lesson did not arrive all at once. It arrived in seasons, each bounded by a date and defined by a different kind of labor: discovery, protection, confrontation, repair, and then the quieter, long work of keeping those repairs intact. To understand it now, I give those seasons dates, not because dates make feelings less messy, but because they help show how small, ordinary acts accumulated into a civic practice. The chronology matters. The dates are the scaffolding of memory, and that scaffolding itself became a subject of inquiry: how institutions, neighbors, banks, and courtrooms respond over time when intimacy has been turned into a vehicle for extraction. Spring 2011. The beginning was ordinary in a way that rendered it almost invisible. On a Tuesday in April, in a house that smelled faintly of soap and lemon cleaner because my mother had kept it that way for decades, I reached for a shoebox on a high shelf in the pantry. It was an object the house would have expected: scuffed, lid bowed from years of being forced back into place. I thought it would be recipes, a stack of postcards, perhaps the grocery list where she wrote what to buy. Instead, there were envelopes with dates and names written in a woman's hand, receipts that did not correspond with conversations I remembered having at the dinner table, bank notices I had never seen, cancelled checks endorsed in a different ink. The detail that arrested me was small and domestic, the sort of thing the social record often overlooks: the way a folded receipt could shift the story of a life. At first, the receipts felt like mistakes. There was a charge for a purchase in a town she had not visited in years, a withdrawn cash sum that did not correspond with anything she could place. The handwriting looked like hers: little flourishes on the Y, the way she crossed her T's. But sometimes the hand felt like the one she had taught me to thread a needle with, and sometimes like a stranger's. Recognizing that curve was intimate and indicting at once. I felt, for the first time, that what we had always called trust could be used as an instrument of erasure. The discovery in April 2011 was not only a private shock, it landed in a wider historical moment. The early 2010s were years when older Americans were increasingly moving their financial lives online, when digital transfers and mobile banking made money feel less tangible, and when demographic shifts, an aging population living longer, sometimes with complex health needs, meant more people were vulnerable to exploitation inside families as well as from strangers. Institutions were only beginning to catch up. Consumer protections and fraud detection systems existed, but they were designed for different kinds of loss: the fraudster at a distance, the identity thief on a screen, rather than the quiet siphoning that can occur within a household. That is why a shoebox, a physical archive of paper, mattered so much. At a moment when money could slip by thumb and thumbprint across invisible channels, paper still spoke. May 2011. We did not move quickly. There was a kind of shame attached to the discovery, an embarrassment that slowed us down. I remember the kitchen table, a fan clicking in the window, my mother pressing the shoebox to her chest and making a little sound that might have been the beginning of a laugh or the end of a sob. The slowness was also procedural. There were phone calls to make, questions to prepare, a sense of needing to build a record before we could ask an institution to take us seriously. We knew delay could be dangerous. Every unlabeled transfer was another grain of sand sloughed from memory. Yet we also recognized that turning the house into a supervised construct would strip her of dignity. So the first months were devoted to imagining protections that preserved autonomy while reducing the opportunities for further expropriation. That modest, ethical dilemma, how to protect without erasing, became a theme of the years ahead. June 2011. The measures we put in place were practical and often humbling. We called the bank and arranged a meeting. A bank representative arrived on a Tuesday morning, sat at the small table, and talked in patient diagrams, account lines and arrows, the difference between an ACH debit and a wire transfer, the conditions under which an internal transfer might be reversed, and the irrevocable quality of a wire that left the institution. She taught us routing numbers and the nuances of account access. We learned to read a ledger the way a pilot learns to read instruments. Constantly, and with respect for small, early warnings. Where previously we had been casual, "Oh, that was him, he sometimes helps," we began to formalize what had been informal. Mortgage and utility payments were set on autopay where feasible. Disbursement routing was checked and double-checked. For discretionary transfers we added friction, a second signature or an online confirmation code sent to my mother's cell phone. We set spending alerts to ping both her and me. If a transfer exceeded a threshold we agreed upon, the bank would text a notification and also send an email to a designated family address. For larger moves, anything over $500 initially, later adjusted as we learned patterns, the bank required joint approval. Transfers to people outside a pre-approved list required documentation of purpose. These were small rules, but they changed the landscape. They did not remove agency, they added visibility. Those conversations at the bank were also revealing in another way. The representative, part of a larger trend among local banks responding to complaints from older customers, was candid about institutional limits. Banks had obligations to account holders but also had legal constraints, privacy rules, retention schedules for records, and the problem of distinguishing an account holder's voluntary generosity from coercion. That conversation altered our strategy. We would not rely on the bank alone. We would create a record in the house that the bank could not otherwise erase or ignore. July, August 2011. We introduced modest household security rituals that were as much about language as they were about procedure. My mother's mail was rerouted through a channel allowing us to intercept suspicious items, credit offers, notices of account changes, without putting her entirely off the grid. We set up a red mailbox next to her favorite chair. She made a ritual of checking it in the morning, pulling items, sometimes reading them aloud. We cross-referenced dates on notices with pencil markings on a calendar on the refrigerator. She learned to scratch account numbers off printed statements before discarding them and to pause at the headers of unsolicited letters, so she could quickly distinguish official correspondence from solicitations. These small practices preserved dignity. She still wrote checks when she wanted to buy a sweater or a teapot, but those checks cleared through a system that required confirmation for atypical amounts or unfamiliar payees. These rituals were informed not only by our own instincts but by conversations I began having with elder advocates and social workers in the summer of 2011. They emphasized how social norms that once protected privacy, assuming a family member was an unquestioned helper, now needed to be balanced with transparency. Older adults had the right to make their own choices, yet institutions and families must also guard against the misuse of intimate authority. Those advocates taught me that small, domestic practices, routing mail differently, keeping a visible calendar, could be as protective as legal instruments because they preserved agency even as they added oversight. August, September 2011. There were small acts of reclamation that mattered as gestures as much as currency. She bought a lightweight sweater she could throw over her shoulders when evenings turned cool and a bright ceramic teapot she placed beside the telephone, filling it each afternoon with chamomile and clover. She bought sandals the wrong size and wore them in the yard because they reminded her of a summer she loved. She bought a spiral notebook with thick pages and used it to draw quilting patterns and jot measurements in a shorthand I recognized. These purchases were not flashy, they were acts of restitution. When a coupon for a free oil change, one of those offers apparently authorized years earlier, found its way into the red mailbox, she drove the car herself, navigated streets she had not taken in months, and paid with a check from an account that had once been hidden from her use. The mechanic complimented her handwriting. She laughed and said, "I felt ordinary." Hearing her say that made me understand why the scaffolding mattered. To feel ordinary after being made less ordinary by betrayal is a quiet victory. Autumn 2011. We had to recalibrate our relationship with my father. He had lived nearby, an everyday presence in the neighborhood for decades. But his presence, once comforting and taken for granted, became fraught. Our communications with him were now mediated by new boundaries. We arranged for his mail to be sent directly to his address when feasible. The aim was to reduce the legal ambiguity that comes when multiple hands intersect on the paper trail. When bills or services required joint contact, we nudged providers to issue notices in his name with oversight from a caseworker as necessary. The caseworker became, in effect, a buffer, someone who could interpret bureaucratic language and call a provider to request copies of ledgers without sounding accusatory. He visited sometimes with awkward gifts, a sandwich wrapped in wax paper, a crossword puzzle with penciled answers in the margins. Other visits were more somber. On one occasion he took out an envelope and offered a check with 2 words written across it, "For trouble." As if a single, small payment could annul a pattern of years. My mother refused the check. That refusal marked an important line for her. She understood, even in her woundedness, that a single gesture could not erase a life of misdirection. Accepting the money would have collapsed a public story into a private transaction. Accountability, she insisted, had to be measured in changes in behavior, transparency, and restoration of agency. Those are not items easily balanced on a ledger, but they were essential. She chose measures that recalibrated power without collapsing into control. Winter 2011, Spring 2012. Family dynamics shifted in complicated ways. We scheduled family sessions. Attendance was irregular. Those who stayed away left us to have conversations over the phone or in passing, conversations laced with thinly veiled incredulity and the old loyalties that can excuse harm. Some siblings defended my father, offering explanations that read like virtues. He had acted out of love, he had been confused, he had meant to help. Others sent notes that resembled forecasts of future avoidance more than apologies. Over time, the family map redrew itself. Some relationships warmed with time and service, some remained shaded. The fracture never healed in the sense of seamlessness. It clothed itself in a layer of stasis that allowed movement, practical, sometimes perfunctory, without pretense. We learned to care at a distance when intimacy had been weaponized for years. This was a season in which the broader social context pressed against our private decisions. In conversations with social workers and at community meetings, I began to map how shame and familial loyalty operate as social forces that often obscure exploitation. Historically, elders have been protected by close-knit families and local communities. Those same bonds can become mechanisms of concealment when one family member assumes the authority to manage another's affairs. This problem is not new. It has recurred across eras, sometimes during periods of economic stress when relatives move in and manage money, other times in the wake of illness when decision-making capacity is in flux. What felt different was the speed and subtlety of transfers in a digital age and the institutional unpreparedness to translate those small shifts into signals of wrongdoing. Summer, Fall 2012. By then, the practical steps hardened into legal action. We pursued a civil judgment, partly as an act of principle and partly for restitution. The civil track was steady and granular: subpoenas for bank statements, depositions with clerks who remembered small, tedious things, and discovery disputes over whether a transfer had been labeled loan repayment or gift. The court ordered restitution where transfers could be tied to identifiable moves in the accounts. Funds that had been sequestered, accounts that looked inconsistent with legitimate expense patterns, were distributed as the law allowed. The victory was partial. Money returned could pay for roof repairs, dental work she had postponed, and a short trip to the coast she had promised herself. The practical significance of those recoveries is worth stating plainly. They were repairs to life, not just to property. Criminal charges were more complicated. Prosecutors must prove a mental state. They need to show intent to defraud beyond a reasonable doubt. When money moves across years in ways that look like routine familial care, checks written for groceries, transfers labeled loan repayment, cash withdrawn with vague explanations, it is difficult to separate poor judgment from criminal intent. Prosecutors I spoke with repeatedly explained that patterns we found persuasive often failed to meet the criminal threshold. The charges they felt confident pursuing were limited by evidentiary rules and criminal standards. In early 2013, the local paper ran a sober account of our case. It did not sensationalize the family drama but opened conversations at coffee shops and church basements about the vulnerability of older adults and the ways family relationships can obscure wrongdoing. This proliferation of conversation, beginning with the paper's coverage in 2013, mattered beyond our family. It fed into a growing public awareness that elder financial abuse is not an anomaly but a structural problem with social consequences. Reduced material security for seniors, increased burdens on social safety nets, and the fracture of trust inside families. As people began to talk openly about the issue, community organizations responded with workshops, and some banks and prosecutors took tentative steps to innovate their practices. March 2013. My testimony in the civil proceeding was one of the season's sharpest public acts. I took the stand and read from the ledger we kept, dates, numbers, payee names, notations in the margins. As I spoke, the paper thickened with meaning. Columns of arithmetic became a map of choices. I described envelopes folded and refold, hours spent comparing deposit times against checks, The way payees shifted over time from utilities and prescriptions to private individuals with no obvious connection to care. The judge cared for chronology, he did not hunger for drama. The clerk recorded the proceedings with the mechanical efficiency of someone who has watched months of human conflict distilled into court minutes. The ledger's arithmetic became persuasive not because it was theatrical, but because it was ordinary and therefore credible. In the months that followed, our case prompted modest institutional shifts. The prosecutor's office, prompted partly by our evidence and by a cluster of similar matters, began to refine how it triaged elder financial abuse. Detectives and clerks received training that emphasized the non-violent nature of many exploitative patterns. They learned new intake questions, not only whether money was missing, but whether there were new payees, unusual initiations of transfers, or repeated cash withdrawals around particular dates. A detective told me later that looking for pattern rather than single glaring moves changed how they investigated. Some banks adjusted their fraud detection thresholds. Suspicious transfer flags were recalibrated to account for abrupt changes in frequency or destination in accounts maintained by older customers. These were not sweeping reforms. Systems resist change. Still, the adjustments nudged practice in a more attentive direction. In a community meeting, a bank representative said quietly, "It helps to see what paper can do." It was an admission. Evidence changes incentives. 2014 to 2016. I began to speak publicly, but in a small, particular way. I did not seek television interviews. I brought the shoebox and the ledger to local meetings. Library basements, senior centers, church halls, the places where neighbors still met for potlucks, quilting bees and advice. People arrived with bowed heads and left with phone numbers for elder law attorneys, printed lists of steps, and a vocabulary for suspicion. I taught basic habits: make photocopies, organize receipts chronologically, set up digital alerts, and explain to banks why an account's activity is concerning without making accusatory claims that could foreclose legal avenues. I showed how to photograph a cancelled check, store it in a locked drive, and write a contemporaneous note after a phone call that might later be useful in court. The hunger for language sustained me. Exploitation disguised as care has its own grammar. A son's insistence that he had been buying groceries for years can be rewritten as a love story. A daughter's claim that her mother is simply forgetful can be a way to explain transfers that otherwise look suspicious. Once people could name the pattern, financial exploitation, they could begin to treat it as a problem that could be addressed rather than a family secret to be protected. That naming matters legally and socially. In the early 2010s, as online banking and electronic transfers became ever more common, patterns of abuse shifted. Suspects could use the speed and seeming invisibility of digital transfers to muddle intent. Teaching a vocabulary for suspicion became a small public intervention in an era when friends and relatives could move money across accounts with a few swipes of a phone. The work also surfaced ethical dilemmas I had not anticipated. Guardianship versus autonomy is not a tidy binary. Guardianship can be both protection and erasure. We met families who wanted centralized authority using the language of relief. If I have responsibility, then others will not take advantage. We met other families whose elders could no longer comprehend the consequences of financial transactions and for whom a guardian was a humane necessity. I learned to ask practical questions that revealed whether centralization was care or control. Does the person understand the nature of transactions? Are transfers documented and reciprocal? Are payments going to accounts with no explanation, or is there a measurable caregiving rationale? Often the answer required compromise, arrangements that left everyone uneasy but safer. Not all outcomes were tidy. In January 2015, a woman at a support meeting told me her bank's electronic records had been purged according to retention schedules. Years earlier, the bank had contracted with a vendor to archive statements and dispose of them after a retention period. Her evidence, meticulously gathered, vanished when server logs were deleted. In another case, a man confessed that a relative had been so convincing in person that prosecutors declined to file charges for lack of proof of criminal intent. Those stories taught a hard lesson: documentation must be continual, and recency matters. A faded receipt can assist, but a sustained pattern is what makes cases actionable. I began to tell people that the most important thing is to give themselves permission to be suspicious and to act quickly. Meanwhile, my mother became an unlikely teacher. From the fall of 2012 onward, she went to quilting class twice a week and sometimes recounted, in the slow convivial way she has, how she had kept a shoebox. "Oh, I kept a shoebox," she would say, raising a finger and smiling as if the admission were a small joke. She showed the quilting group how she dated envelopes and wrote small notes. Check for oil change 8/12, or gave Terry $50 for taxes, for thirds, and insisted softly on the dignity of keeping such records. The idea that a domestic object could carry juridical weight seemed odd at first. Yet the shoebox had become a repository for the memory of a life. Members of the quilting group leaned forward, listened, and began to copy her habit. They started exchanging practical advice as if trading patterns rather than secrets. 2016 to 2017. We built practical, repeatable systems. We set up quarterly meetings with a financial advisor she trusted, someone with a patient voice and an obvious respect for choice. He reviewed joint accounts every 3 months, not to dictate but to document and confirm together what had been spent and why. We strengthened digital defenses, stronger passwords, a password manager with a small instruction card my mother could use, multi-factor authentication, and statements accessible online with limited sharing. We scanned and backed up receipts to a locked drive. Digital proofs, an email confirming payment successfully processed, a timestamp, became a different kind of evidence. Those logs gave my mother a new kind of confidence, different from the buoyant forgetfulness that had previously been exploited. The chores of bureaucracy were soul-sapping. There were long holds on the phone, forms that required notarization in particular configurations, appeals that demanded repetition. There is an unglamorous endurance to bureaucratic labor, a clerk who finally corrected a misposted deposit, a manager who agreed to reverse an unauthorized fee. These were small victories, stitches in a patchwork repair. Each corrected ledger entry restored a bit of narrative coherence to our household finances. There were comic interludes. Once a woman from the county welfare office took my mother aside at a clinic and explained a modest prescription assistance benefit she had been eligible for but had not been enrolled in. "You used to let him do that for you," the woman said, meaning my father, plain and gentle. My mother, whose humor is dry, shrugged as if decades had folded into a single exhalation. The benefit was modest, a few $100s a year, but when we put it into the ledger it read like honor returned in miniature. It felt like a small correction, an official recognition that systems had failed and were offering a minor reparation. We did not recover everything. Some money had been spent in ways that left no trail: small store purchases, cash payments to people who were paid in hand, transfers recorded under other names. Those losses hurt because they were diffuse and untraceable. Yet the money we did recover mattered in tangible ways: a repaired roof, overdue dental work, the trip my mother finally took to the coast. We learned to accept that some losses would remain uncompensated and to invest the resources we could reclaim into repair and pleasure rather than letting them remain talismans of loss. Forgiveness proved stubbornly resistant to ledger-based repair. My mother never announced forgiveness publicly. Some days she forgave him, some days she did not. Anger surfaced in small acts, refusing to let him sit at the head of the table, a curt remark that exposed a remembered slight. Those acts were not setbacks. They were part of her autonomy. True forgiveness, if it comes, must be voluntary. I often reminded myself that anger is a reasonable response to betrayal and that pressuring someone to forgive is itself a form of coercion. There was also a transformation in me. Initially I had a fury that felt necessary, a match struck in the wind. Over time my hands steadied, the ledger became less an act of accusation than a work of assembly. I learned to sit with facts and pull them together into a narrative outsiders could read and officials could act upon. That work changed how I understood responsibility. It taught me that love can be corrosive when used as an excuse for control, and that sometimes true care is the willingness to make a life legible to its owner. I preserved the shoebox. We treated it like an artifact. Visitors wanted to see it and sometimes touched the envelopes as if contact could transmit understanding. I kept extra copies, scanned the records into a locked drive, and archived the photographs with dated file names. Those actions were both protective and ceremonial. The box ceased being a hiding place and became a tool for remembrance and evidence. 2018 to 2019. As I tried to catalogue what we had done well and what could have been better, I returned again and again to small habits that made the largest difference, saving every unusual slip, committing to contemporaneous notes even when it felt petty, acting on small and persistent complaints rather than waiting for a cricket-loud moment of fraud. If there is one piece of advice I gave most often in workshops and informal meetings, it was deceptively simple: treat paper and memory as allies. When an older relative voices concern, however tentative, write it down. Make copies of every bank notice. Keep the process shared and visible. Create a habit of quarterly reconciliation. It is not elegant, but it works. We tried to teach suspicion without fostering paranoia. There is a balance between vigilance and living under perpetual watch. We taught neighbors to set reasonable thresholds for flags and how to approach a bank with curiosity rather than accusation. One afternoon, a neighbor brought in a faded check and asked if it could help. It turned into a lesson about retention. Save everything, I said. Even faded receipts. If a pattern emerges, those artifacts congeal into an intelligible story. We developed templates and scripts, a simple form to record conversations about money, date, time, caller, subject, what was said, a checklist for vetting new payees, names, relationships, why payment was legitimate, and a short script for contacting a bank to request a review. The bank script was intentionally unthreatening. I'm calling for a review of recent activity in account holder X's ledger. I'm a family member with concerns about unfamiliar payees and would like to request a temporary hold while we verify. These tools were practical, repeatable, and ultimately not novel in a technological sense, but they were the mechanics of resilience. The prosecutor's office used some of our materials in training. I was asked to address a small seminar for detectives and clerks and brought photocopies of the ledger and the shoebox. We role-played bank calls, demonstrated how to request retention of records, and showed how a mundane receipt can be pivotal when placed as part of a sequence. The emphasis was on continuity. Exploitation often reveals itself in gradual, patterned shifts, new payees, increased frequency of withdrawals, sudden deviations from long-standing habits. Detectives appreciated that a series of ordinary-looking receipts could be the most persuasive evidence precisely because they resisted melodrama. We learned to talk about dignity in concrete terms. People worried that documenting everything would humiliate their parents. Reframing helped: documentation as insurance, not surveillance. We taught families to hold joint meetings with the elder, to label ledger entries with mutual agreement, and to have an accountant or trusted advisor sign off quarterly. The act of recording became collaborative rather than punitive, a ritual of mutual care in which the elder's voice mattered. The shoebox taught another lesson: evidence can be low-tech. In an era of encrypted files and promises of blockchain certainty, a folded receipt in an envelope can still do practical legal work. The envelopes were yellowed, softened at the edges, bearing pencil notes and terse descriptions. In court, their sequential order told a story digital records sometimes obscure, a timeline of presence and absence, of payments that matched and payments that did not. The tactile feel of paper conveyed gravity to judges, prosecutors, and social workers in a way screens occasionally fail to do. We have not stopped being vigilant. Scams evolve and technologies change. Family members who mean well can unwittingly enable patterns of exploitation. Yet the shoebox's basic lesson remains: documentation disarms charm. Records anchor memory. When someone insists an elder is simply forgetful, a contemporaneous ledger can offer an alternative account. When someone claims they acted for the family, a record can show where family money actually went. These are not arguments that replace reconciliation, but they create conditions in which reconciliation, if it happens, is not coerced. There are small, unglamorous moments that count as grace. An envelope with a grocery receipt that shows a strange $200 purchase in a distant town revealed a trip I had not known about and allowed us to ask questions rather than invent. A bank email confirming a wire reversal restored a portion of peace. The financial advisor, now a friend, sits across from my mother and listens as she explains why she purchased a particular set of fabrics, then notes the transaction with an approving nod. Those everyday things accumulate into a life restored in modest, meaningful increments. In the cool light of late afternoon, she sits with a quilt folded across her knees and the shoebox within reach. She turns an envelope over in her hands, smooths a flap, reads a line she wrote years ago, and sometimes smiles. The smile is not triumphal. It is an expression of recognition, of a life reconstituted by memory and records. The ledger remains a witness to both loss and endurance. When I tell this story, I stick to the facts as we lived them: the shoebox with its dated envelopes, the ledger with columns of payees and sums, the changes we made to account access, the quarterly meetings with a trusted advisor, the civil judgment that returned part of what was lost, the limited criminal consequences shaped by evidentiary standards, the modest community ripple that followed. I tell of prosecutor training, bank policy tweaks, neighborhood meetings where we taught people to copy receipts, and the ethical questions about autonomy and guardianship we repeatedly encountered. These are not glamorous acts, but they have teeth. They can protect a person's dignity in the small, lettered ways that matter. Yet the story is also part of a larger historical arc. Financial exploitation of older adults is not merely an individual failing, but a social problem that intersects with demographic change, technological transformation, and institutional design. In the decades before 2011, family structures shifted, mobility spread relatives across cities and states, banking became more centralized and more digitized. Those trends created both conveniences and vulnerabilities. The early 2010s were, in many communities, the moment when the daily practices of money management, writing checks, balancing a checkbook, handing an envelope, met the instantaneous tools of today: wire transfers, mobile deposits, peer-to-peer payments. The law and the institutions that enforce it were catching up, slowly, to a world where a loving hand could also be an exploitative one. If I could leave one concrete piece of advice, it would be simple: do not underestimate the power of small acts of documentation. Keep the receipts, date the conversations, make the ledger a shared object, and treat paper as an ally. When an elder says something that sounds suspicious, write it down. When you see a pattern, act. Bureaucracy is slow, and the law is limited, but ordinary records can persuade a clerk, an officer, or a judge in ways stories alone sometimes cannot. The shoebox taught us how to make a life legible. That work was less about retribution than restoration. We sought restitution because it allowed repairs, new shingles, overdue dental work, a seaside trip, not because we wanted punishment for its own sake. The legal system, with its different tracks and thresholds, will not always deliver a satisfying moral accounting. Civil judgments returned currency, criminal law sometimes could not secure conviction. Yet the civil remedies we obtained mattered because they were material acts of repair. There are quieter, ongoing labor and institutions that grew from our experience. Local senior centers added workshops. A county detective described adjusting intake forms to ask specifically about changes in payees and irregular withdrawals. A bank representative told me that training employees to ask a single extra question, "Has the account holder authorized this transfer?" made a difference in dozens of cases. Those small institutional shifts are uneven, but over time they accumulate in the same way a shoebox accumulates paper. The public response we saw, neighborly meetings, small trainings, a modest shift in bank practice, showed that private harm can create public learning. A final scene returns me to the kitchen and to rhythm. On a Tuesday in April many years later, I find myself reaching for the shoebox again. The house is the same, and not the same. The lemon cleaner scent lingers. My mother still keeps a towel over the banister when it rains. I lift the lid and feel the weight of the envelopes, the shiver of paper. I run my thumb along a cursive line she wrote in 2009. The ledger sits on the table, a heavy book with columns of sums and notes. I close it slowly. It is less like a weapon now and more like a map, where we have been, the creases and patches, the routes we could take. In the end, the lesson is not that records are a cure-all. Nothing undoes a wound or promises perfect protection. The lesson is that ordinary acts, repeated and preserved, create a possibility, a life reconstituted by memory and proof. My mother did not change in essence. What changed was that she reclaimed more of her life. She made decisions and mistakes that were hers again. The shoebox, once a hiding place, became both symbol and instrument, a lowly object that taught us to resist a sophisticated form of intimacy used to consume. Years later, when I close the ledger, it feels less like a weapon than a map. It shows where we have been and where we might go. It measures, in small increments, the repair of trust and the insistence on truth. The records anchor memory. They make possible a life that is, if not unscarred, at least legible. That, finally, is enough, imperfect but invaluable, a remedy that comes not from retribution alone but from restoring a life to itself. And so the seasons continue. There are always new forms of fraud, new ways for intimacy to be repurposed, new technological affordances that can help or hurt. But the practices we learned, document, share, convene, insist on dignity, offer a durable scaffolding. In the wash of modern life, when cash slips through invisible streams and good intentions can veil harm, the shoebox and the ledger stand as a reminder. The ordinary work of keeping memory anchored is itself a civic act. It is the work of turning private evidence into public safety, of translating a personal ledger into communal knowledge, and of insisting that autonomy and protection need not be enemies but partners in the long project of living freely into old age. The storage unit, when we finally opened it, became the point at which the private story folded into public record. It was June 2013, 2 years after the ledger's last careful entry and a year after the first conversations with the bank, when the realtor, the estate lawyer, and I drove down to the self-storage facility outside town. My father had rented the unit for decades under his name. The rental agreement we pulled that afternoon showed a start date of March 1987. The length of that contract, a small bureaucratic line in a file, matched the ledger's arc, 25 years, the span my siblings and I eventually described in the complaint we filed in 2014. That quarter century, once a family secret, now had a neat administrative marker on a tab of paper. What we found inside the unit was messy and methodical at once. There were moving boxes, a metal filing cabinet with its rusted drawer tracks, and, tucked in a corner, a plastic milk crate of manila envelopes sealed with masking tape. The shoebox, already familiar to my mother and me, had been one repository. The storage crate contained more, duplicate ledgers in my father's handwriting, bank statements, carbon copies of checks, and a stack of appointment cards for doctors' offices and therapists. There were also receipts from travel agencies, credit card slips stamped with locations hundreds of miles from our town, and a sheaf of power of attorney documents signed, in different years, in different ink. The POA forms were particularly consequential. One bore a date of October 1998 and was notarized at a small commercial notary near our grocery store. Another was signed much later, in March 2005, and had an alternate notary stamp. The handwriting on one matched my father's. The signatures on several checks, when compared by a forensic analyst we later engaged, showed consistent pressure and stylus habits with my father's known writing. The storage unit contained, too, cancelled checks whose endorsements were faintly different, suggesting they had been negotiated in varying hands. That inventory, taken together with the ledger's dated entries and the shoebox receipts my mother had kept, formed a mosaic of behavior across decades. The chronology began to feel less like a collection of separate crimes and more like a rhythm of appropriation. There were seasons where withdrawals accelerated. Tax time sweeps in March and April, summer transfers coinciding with trips he had taken alone, and November withdrawals that matched purchases for household needs that my mother would later insist she had never authorized. The paperwork also revealed another pattern, entries in calendars where my father had scheduled bank errands on days when my mother's appointments ran long. In one calendar page, annotated in a cramped blue pen, was a cryptic note on June 12, 2003, move funds. E won't notice. The entry had once seemed like a private boast. In court it read like a confession. Confronting those pages was a peculiar, delayed form of vindication for my mother. For years he had told her, and told other people, that she was losing it, that she forgot bills, double paid, or invented purchases. He had used the language of concern as a smokescreen for control. The storage unit materials undercut that script. They showed patterns of him inserting his name as payee, of wire transfers initiated from his home computer at 3 in the morning, of ATM withdrawals in towns she had never visited. The shoebox receipts she had kept in the kitchen drawer, those grocery stubs, fabric purchases, and hand-noted appointment reminders, resurfaced against the storage unit archive with a clarifying effect. The ledger's small, handwritten notes matched the receipts' dates, the cancelled checks matched transfers recorded only in his handwriting. Where he had called her forgetful, the documents said she had been meticulous. We filed suit in late 2014. The civil complaint named my father and, after his death in July 2015, his estate. The complaint drew on the ledger, the shoebox, and the storage unit contents. The estate lawyer framed the claim as restitution for breaches of fiduciary duty and conversion. The criminal angle, pursued briefly by the county prosecutor, stalled for 2 reasons that became instructive for our later trainings. First, the burdens of proof were high, particularly for acts that fell into gray areas of consent and for a defendant who had, for years, mixed small acts of care with larger acts of exploitation. Second, my father's death in mid-2015 effectively foreclosed a full criminal reckoning. The prosecutor's office told us, with professional steadiness, that they could not proceed if the key actor was deceased. They pursued, instead, an administrative audit with the banks and focused on better enforcement strategies going forward. The civil track, by contrast, yielded partial remedies. In May 2016, a judge entered a judgment against the estate that ordered the return of a portion of the funds my father had diverted. The amount was modest against the total erosion my mother had endured, but it paid for much-needed repairs to the house, covered a backlog of dental work, and funded the small seaside trip we had promised her. Judges' orders, after all, have teeth where moral reproach does not. Restitution allowed practical repairs. The ledger and the storage unit archive had made the story legally legible in ways testimony alone could not. Even so, the civil outcome felt partial. The law can repair value but not time. It can return dollars but not the quiet hours stolen or the years of belittlement endured. Outside the courtroom, something else shifted. The county bank that held my parents' primary accounts instituted a pilot policy in late 2016. When a frequent payee began to show recurring large transfers to a single secondary account, the bank flagged the activity for a senior wealth specialist to review and asked a single, simple question of its tellers. Has the account holder confirmed this transfer in person? Before enabling a large outflow. The local sheriff's office changed intake forms in early 2017 to capture longer transaction histories and to ask whether an elder's usual payees had altered over the previous year. The state's Adult Protective Services Office, citing our case as one among several in a briefing memo, revised training in 2018 to emphasize contemporaneous record-keeping and family-led documentation rituals. Those changes were small, uneven, and geographically limited, but they reflected a shift from reactive policing to anticipatory design. Our prosecutor's office used the storage unit as a teaching case. In a seminar, we videotaped a staged interview, reproducing the ledger entries and receipts and showing how an officer can chain a series of innocuous transactions into a pattern of exploitation. We demonstrated practically how to preserve storage unit evidence, how to photograph boxes in situ, how to inventory envelopes by sequence, and how to document chain of custody so that judges would accept the paper trail. The presence of the storage unit in the seminar helped officers see the difference between a missing receipt and a pattern. The act of preservation itself was litigation and care. There were, over the next several years, quieter community effects. A senior center that had not previously offered financial literacy sessions began hosting monthly drop-in clinics in 2017, staffed by a retired accountant and a volunteer bank employee, where neighbors could bring bank statements and ask practical questions about unfamiliar withdrawals. In 2019, a small coalition of community organizations launched a ledger project that handed out pre-printed registers and envelopes to seniors at farmers markets and at free clinic days. The distribution was modest, the idea even more so, to make documentation portable and ordinary. The shoebox became an emblem at these clinics, a way to talk about dignity without sounding accusatory. Technology also entered the story in unexpected ways. Our first instinct had been anti-digital. Keep paper, we said, keep the tactile record. Yet the storage unit had contained CDs, burned bank statements from the early 2000s, and a later audit used those digital records to trace electronic transfers that paper sometimes obscured. By 2018, the county began to recommend a hybrid model, a simple ledger and a paired digital backup, whether scanned or photographed, stored in a trusted cloud account with two-factor authentication that an elder controlled. The paradox was instructive. Technology both enabled and could be marshaled against exploitation. The state later issued guidance that recommended a 2-adult sign-off for transfers above certain thresholds for public benefits accounts, an idea inspired in part by the pattern we had exposed in the files of my father's storage unit. Personal reconciliation remained partial and delicate. My mother, in the years after the judgment, made careful choices about relationships. She forgiven in small increments, more interested in practical peace than in vindictive closure. There were afternoons, in 2017 and 2018, when she would make a tea and sit in the living room with the ledger open, but not as a weapon. She would show it to friends when they asked about managing money. She would sometimes put a receipt inside the quilt she was working on as a small memorial. The storage unit items were sealed back into court evidence for a time and then returned in part. Some documents the estate retained for tax purposes, and some copies remained with us for posterity. The physical weight of those papers carried a new meaning, proof that she had been lucid and intentional, that the record of her life could not, in fact, be erased by a steady hand. The public learning, however, sat side by side with larger forces. The pattern we had documented was one node in a national trend. Between 2010 and 2020, the population over 65 grew in the United States. More families were making decisions across greater distances. Wealth and assets had begun to consolidate in financial instruments that could be moved with a few clicks. Those macro trends made the petty, repetitive acts of exploitation we had documented both easier to execute and harder to detect unless someone practiced the modest bureaucratic art of record-keeping. Our case, the storage unit items, and the shoebox became a kind of micro-history of those broader shifts, how intimacy, mobility, and digitization conspired to create a new terrain for older-age vulnerability. Pandemic years intensified those dynamics. In 2020, with doors closed and families scattered, our county saw a spike in reports involving third-party caregivers and family members who managed accounts remotely. The ledger and shoebox strategy, adapted for remote life, became a template for video-led meetings where an elder would hold the receipt to the camera while a child recorded the transaction and asked clarifying questions aloud. The ritual of making transactions public in real time, naming payees on video, saving screenshots, and emailing them to a designated family member, grew into a practice that preserved dignity through transparency. The storage unit materials had taught us the value of contemporaneity. A document created at the time of a transaction carries a different moral and legal force than a recollection created later. By 2022 and through 2024, the county had added an elder financial abuse desktop guide for bank tellers and a suggested script for professionals. One line about concern and one practical step to document the account holder's response. Legislators in neighboring counties held hearings that cited our files as examples of why bank thresholds for automatic review should be lowered, and state-level advocates used the story to argue for clearer standards around durable power of attorney forms, how they are notarized, how revocations are handled, and what periodic accounting is required when POA is in effect. Those conversations had the scent of structural reform, though change remained incremental. And yet, even as institutions adjusted, the personal work of keeping memory anchored continued to matter more than any single law. In 2023, on an autumn afternoon, I visited my mother and we sat with the ledger open between us. She had begun by then to give small trainings of her own, showing a neighbor how to keep a simple index of expenses, calling a distant niece to walk through a bank website step by step, and making a ritual of ringing a bell whenever she called a bank to change a payee so that the family would be alerted. The storage unit, the shoebox, the ledger, each had, in different ways, been transformed from instruments of breach into instruments of repair and education. The story is not over. There will be new technologies, payment apps, biometric authentication, perhaps new forms of digital trust, and with them new vulnerabilities. There will be people who exploit systems from within families and people who attempt to profiteer from the confusion of aging. But there is also a set of modest practices that build resilience: contemporaneous records, shared rituals of documentation, community clinics that teach ordinary ledger keeping, and institutional reflexes that treat elders' finances as a matter of dignity rather than suspicion. The storage unit taught me that control can be disguised as care for long periods, that paper resists invention, and that the arc of restitution is slow. The shoebox taught that dignity can be defended in small acts repeated over time. Those two objects, a crate in a storage facility and an envelope of grocery slips in a kitchen drawer, altered a life and nudged a community toward greater attentiveness, and they continue to travel with us into whatever comes next. After 2024, the work of translation, turning a private ledger into public practice, settled into a rhythm that felt less like a triumph than like ongoing repair. In the spring of 2025, the county offered me a one-year consulting stipend to formalize the Ledger Project's curriculum, and I spent those months traveling between senior centers, bank branches, and small-town libraries, teaching the modest arts that had rearranged my mother's life. The syllabus we produced was intentionally banal: how to make a contemporaneous note, how to staple receipts to an index card, how to photograph an envelope and email the image to 2 trusted contacts. We emphasized language, what to say when a teller asked about a transfer, what to write in a simple memo for a check, because the rhetorical economy of those exchanges had proved decisive in our case. Between March and December 2025 we held 37 workshops. Attendance was uneven, but in each room someone would eventually whisper, "We need a shoebox," and others would nod as if remembering a relative's kitchen drawer. Those nods were a sign that the practice had become portable. Institutional change continued, halting and uneven. The county bank that had instituted the teller's question in late 2016 expanded its pilot in 2026 into what it called a safeguard account protocol for customers over 70. The protocol was not a panacea, it required consent paperwork, and in the first 6 months it produced several awkward instances in which family members complained of paternalism. Yet in a few clear cases the safeguard had stopped transfers that, with hindsight, looked like predatory outflows. The sheriff's office used a thin local grant in 2025 to equip one detective with advanced digital forensics training. She became the person officers consulted on matter-of-fact things like cleaned metadata and cloud trails. Adult Protective Services, stretched in every county in the state, folded our lessons into its continuing education requirement. If an APS worker opened a case involving assets above a modest threshold, the worker now had a checklist that included request contemporaneous records and ask about changes in routine payees over the last 3 years. Those procedural accretions did not, on their own, prevent exploitation, but they made exploitation harder to hide. The larger policy debates that had begun in 2022 and 2023 continued to gnaw at the edges of practice. Legislators in neighboring counties held hearings through 2025 that borrowed our case as an emblem. Nonprofit advocates drafted model language for durable power of attorney forms that required annual accounting reports when assets exceeded certain levels. Those proposals encountered familiar frictions. Guardianship reform advocates wary of instruments that might erode autonomy, probate judges concerned about administrative burdens, elder rights groups pushing back on any scheme that looked like surrogate control. In public testimony there was, by late 2025, a new rhetorical consensus that the problem was not only criminality but also the mundane capacity to witness transactions in real time. The ledger insisted, still, that contemporaneity mattered. Academic attention followed. In the autumn of 2026 a law review article cited our files, the ledger, the CDs, the storage unit inventory, as evidence of a pattern of incremental financial erosion in family contexts. A social work researcher used the shoebox as a case study for an ethnography of household paperwork, arguing that the transformation of domestic spaces into sites of financial governance had shifted the burden of vigilance onto older adults themselves. The reach of these essays was modest, one might have expected more, but their existence mattered because it reoriented part of the scholarly conversation from guardianship to quotidian accountability. The storage unit archive, which the county had agreed to hold for teaching, became a kind of micro-exhibit for trainings. Not glamorous, not sensational, but stubbornly persuasive. Officers and students who saw the yellowing envelopes seemed to register, in a way that testimony could not always produce, the temporal arc of erosion. Technology did not relent. If anything, it accelerated the dialectic between facilitation and exploitation. Between 2024 and 2027 mobile payment apps introduced interfaces that made peer-to-peer transfers nearly frictionless. And with that convenience came new forms of risk, pay my bill texts that impersonated family members, voice-cloned messages that could mimic a son's cadence, and ephemeral app notifications that left no paper trail. The hybrid model the county recommended, a paper ledger paired with a cloud backup, had to adapt. Our workshops added modules about two-factor authentication and about naming a digital witness, a sibling or neighbor asked to receive screenshots of transactions. A small startup in the region developed a simple app designed with our input. It paired a picture of a signed check with a time-stamped video in which the elder read a short memorized phrase. The app then emailed the materials to 2 designated people and archived them in an encrypted folder. It was a low-budget solution to a high-tech problem, and its adoption was slow, especially among people who distrusted screens. But where it worked, it often spared families the slow, painful act of proof that my mother had once endured. There were, inevitably, moral and emotional tensions. Some relatives bristled at what they perceived as surveillance, and some elders resisted practices they felt infantilized them. A neighbor of my mother's, reticent, fiercely independent, refused to let anyone see her bank statements. She told me in 2026 that she would rather die than hand over her finances. That stubbornness was familiar and must be respected. Dignity, after all, includes the dignity to take risks. Our work could only offer options, not impose them. We learned to speak of safeguards as affordances rather than prisons. If you want, we can make a copy of this receipt and store it in your shoebox, we would say, and sometimes that was enough. In other cases it was not. My mother's life continued along its quiet, stubborn trajectory. She celebrated small victories, a newly repaired porch step in the summer of 2025 that she could climb without pausing, a dental implant completed in 2017 that had transformed the way she laughed, the seaside trip in 2016 whose memory she would sometimes slip into conversation like a secret. She also experienced the small erosions that come with age, a temper that frayed more easily, a memory that needed more patient scaffolding, aches that announced themselves in the morning. Her use of the ledger evolved into a teaching practice that felt generative. In 2026 she convened an informal receipt circle at the senior center, where 3 of her friends and a volunteer would bring bills and work through a register. The work was practical, but it was also social. The ritual of laying receipts on the table produced ordinary acts of mutual aid. The storage unit items, the CDs, the boxes, the battered index cards, remained in her mind, relics of a past wrong. She would look at them sometimes and say, with a mix of indignation and wry humor, "I have better handwriting than he gave me credit for." There were moments when the legal past returned with a particular sting. In late 2025, a distant cousin filed a minor claim against part of the estate, arguing that my father had, in his lifetime, transferred funds with familial consent. That claim was dismissed, and the county's written inventory of the storage unit materials, photographed, catalogued, and held in a secure file, helped the probate clerk adjudicate the matter quickly. Still, the experience reminded us that the past remains legible to many possible readers. Paper does not speak for itself without someone who knows how to listen. We continued to teach how to make testimony legible, to make the memos, to date the envelopes, to build a chain of contemporaneous witnesses. The ritual of documentation had become for us a form of protection and a language for remembrance. The narrative of our family's case also intersected with larger debates about who should carry the burden of guardianship and how the state should intervene. Between 2025 and 2027, several policy proposals circulated that sought to require periodic accounting for non-family fiduciaries and to create a low-cost mediation option for disputed transfers. The proposals attracted advocates, skeptics, and lobbyists. None achieved statewide adoption in those years, but the conversation mattered because it reframed exploitation as not only a criminal act but a public administration problem. My own advocacy in those legislative moments was deliberately modest. I testified about practice, not about punishment. I brought the ledger as an exhibit and told legislators that simple rules, 2 signatures above a threshold, a checklist for banks, often made the difference between a recoverable wrong and irreversible loss. The lawmakers listened in part because the problem had become visible in a way it had not been before. The pedagogical work extended beyond elders themselves. In 2026, several high school civics classes invited me to speak about the ethics of money and family, and I found myself describing the ledger as a civic technology, a practice that enabled strangers, bank tellers, clerks, deputies, to do the small thing that made justice possible. Teenagers, who had grown up in a world of instantaneous transfers, were surprised to learn that the physical act of attaching a receipt to a register could have legal force. Their curiosity felt like a kind of cultural inoculation. If a generation grew up seeing documentation as part of ordinary dignity, perhaps future abuses would be harder to sustain. The storage unit itself, the physical place where our proof had lain, continued to haunt me. In 2027, the county archives agreed to accept a curated selection of the materials as part of an effort to collect local histories of caregiving. We negotiated which items to donate: the ledger, scans of the CDs, the storage unit inventory, and a small bundle of letters that my mother had kept.